I once believed I was the master of my own mind, that every choice, every reaction was the product of reason and life experience. But then one day, I discovered this truth. Some thoughts were never truly mine. They were just unconscious reflexes I kept repeating. Decisions I thought were logical turned out to be the result of countless invisible traps in the brain. And the most shocking part was this: they were not only in me, they existed in every human brain, no exceptions.
They influence you, shape you, and even lead you into mistakes you thought were your own personal choices. You are not as conscious as you think. The question is, when will you truly wake up and take back control from the very things that have been steering you from within? After realizing I was not truly in control of my mind the way I had always believed, I began to observe every reaction, every choice, every thought I once assumed was natural. And I discovered something that sent chills through me. They were not natural. They were programmed. One of the most dangerous traps hidden deep in the structure of my thinking, and perhaps in yours as well, is survivorship bias. It sounds abstract, but let me tell you a story so you can see how you might be falling into it every single day. During World War II, the U.S. military analyzed the aircraft returning from bombing missions. They noticed the wings, fuselage, and tail of these planes were riddled with bullet holes. The first conclusion was, we need to add more armor to these areas. It seemed logical, but one man disagreed. Abraham Wald, a mathematician, pointed out something critical everyone else had missed. These are the areas where planes can take hits and still come back. The areas without bullet holes on the surviving planes? Those could be the fatal spots, the places where, if hit, no one survived to bring the plane home, and therefore, there was no data. The result: they reinforced the areas without damage and saved countless lives. Do you see it now? We tend to focus only on the survivors, the successful entrepreneurs, the famous individuals, the buildings that have stood for centuries, forgetting that behind all that glory lies a silent graveyard of invisible failures. You see thriving startups and think, I could do that too. But you don't see the thousands of other businesses that went broke, the teams that sat in their final meeting to declare bankruptcy. You see someone fall in love and believe love is beautiful, destined, but you don't see the broken hearts, the promises left unkept, the people who walked away without a word. You hear about someone dropping out of school and succeeding, and you wonder, why can't I? But you never hear the stories of those who also dropped out, dreamed big, worked hard, and never had their names remembered. We are not good at seeing what no longer exists. And that is exactly what makes this trap so dangerous. Survivorship bias makes us underestimate risk, creates illusions of ease, and paints journeys full of blood and tears as if they were paved with roses. But the scariest part is this: it makes us blame ourselves when we fail. We cannot see how many others failed just like us simply because they are no longer here. And so we turn inward, labeling ourselves as weak, useless. That's a double blow: delusion and self-destruction. If you truly want to understand your chances of success in career, in love, or in life, you must also look at what no longer exists. Ask yourself, what has disappeared? Who never told their story? How many others walked into this dream and never came back out? Awareness begins with the ability to see the invisible. Are you ready to take off the glittering glasses and see the full picture? Because if you don't, you are betting your entire future on only half the truth. And the other half, sometimes, is the difference between life and death.
Do you believe that what you see might actually be what is deceiving you every day? A single flawed perspective could be causing you to misjudge risk, make wrong decisions, and suffer needless disappointment. Part 1 will make you rethink everything.
Have you ever felt like a failure while others seem to succeed so easily? Maybe you are not inadequate. Maybe you are simply being fooled by a mental trap everyone falls into, and no one has told you until now. Why do most people misjudge their own chances of success? There is one thinking error that convinces you that you are capable when you are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. You do not want to be the only one who doesn't know this. Have you ever praised yourself with, "I'm really good at this," when things go smoothly, but then blamed others, circumstances, or even the universe whenever you fail? I used to do exactly that. When I achieved good results at work, I believed it was because I was smart, hardworking, and had vision. But when a project failed, I told myself, the client kept changing their requirements. It was the market. It was because others didn't do their job. From the outside, I might have seemed rational, but on the inside, I was stuck in a sweet trap, the self-serving bias. This is a subtle yet extremely dangerous way of protecting the ego because it makes you feel you are always right and that the world is what needs to change, not you. Imagine a CEO. When the company grows, he appears on magazine covers, giving powerful speeches about strategic decisions. But when sales drop, he talks about inflation, tax policies, and unfair competitors. Our ego hates being blamed. It instantly builds walls of external reasons, while quietly taking all credit for successes as personal victories. The dangerous part is, you don't even realize you are doing it. You believe it's true. You think, "I'm just being honest," when in fact, you're being driven by a deeply instinctive defense mechanism.
The self-serving bias doesn't just make you delude yourself, it also prevents you from learning from failure. Because if failure is always someone else's fault, there's nothing for you to improve. I realized that when I began pausing and asking myself, was I wrong somewhere? That was when I truly started to grow. Growth begins with accepting that you are not always right, and that even when you succeed, it is not solely your own doing.
But here's the irony. This trap doesn't just apply to yourself. It's tightly linked to another thinking error, the fundamental attribution error. When I am late for work, I blame traffic. But when someone else is late, I quietly think they lack discipline and responsibility. One time, a colleague lost her temper in a meeting. I judged her as hot-tempered and unprofessional. But the next day, I snapped under pressure myself and excused it by saying, "I didn't get enough sleep." What does that mean? It means that when I am wrong, I have reasons. But when others are wrong, it's their character. And from there, I judge. I build simple stories about other people without knowing what was truly going on inside them. These two thinking errors are like two sides of the same coin, protecting the ego while hurting others. They turn you into a worse version of yourself while making you believe you're being rational and fair. But when I started listening to feedback I didn't want to hear, when I accepted that I could be wrong, and when I learned to forgive others with understanding, that's when I truly found inner freedom. I no longer had to force myself to prove I was always right. Have you ever caught yourself in those reactions? Share your answer in the comments. I'd like to hear your story. And if this struck a chord with you, hit like and subscribe, because the journey of self-reflection is far from over. Did you know that most of the time, you are not as objective as you think? There's a thinking error that makes you believe you are always right, and in doing so, it can destroy even your best relationships. Have you ever felt unfairly judged? Or have you ever rushed to conclude something about another person based on one small action? This section will help you look at yourself with honesty and courage. If you don't know about this thinking error, you could ruin your career, lose friends, and even miss out on love without understanding why. Don't skip this part. It will change the way you see others and yourself. I used to have a bad habit that I only became clear-eyed about much later. I judged people far too quickly, not because I wanted to be arrogant, but because I thought I was reading human nature. When someone was late, I labeled them irresponsible. When they were curt, I tagged them as hot-tempered. When they failed, I concluded, they're just not good enough. But there was a strange contradiction. When I was in the exact same situations, I always pointed to circumstances. I was late because of traffic. I snapped because of pressure. I failed because conditions were unfavorable. This thinking error has a very clear name, the fundamental attribution error. It is a distorted mirror. It gave me a grand image of myself. I'm a good person, just under stress. And others? They're bad people. I thought I was evaluating reality, but in truth, I was using two different measuring sticks, one for myself and one for everyone else. And that not only distanced me from others, it blinded me to myself. You can think of it this way. When you see someone behaving in a way that doesn't meet your expectations, instead of asking, what's happening with them, you ask, what kind of person are they? That question is the doorway to some of the most distorted judgments you can make.
This trap is so subtle because it makes you feel like you understand people. It creates the illusion that if you're smart enough, you can tell who is good or bad, lazy or hardworking, incompetent or excellent in just a few minutes of interaction. But in reality, you're only seeing the surface. And the surface, like every lake, never tells the whole story of what's beneath. I remember once when a colleague spoke to me with a slightly cold tone.
I spent the whole day thinking, she doesn't respect me. But by the end of the day, I learned her husband was in the hospital. That was the moment I realized I had been too quick to build an inaccurate story from a fleeting behavior, and I felt ashamed, not because she was wrong, but because I had been too hasty. At its core, this thinking error is a lack of patience. We are not patient enough to dig deeper, to ask, to understand. We want to judge quickly because it makes us feel in control. But the truth is, you cannot understand a person if you do not know their story. Every behavior is a chapter you haven't read closely. When I changed my question from who are they to what's happening with them, I stepped into a new world, a world where empathy speaks before judgment, where curiosity replaces conclusion, where I sit down to listen instead of standing above to evaluate. The fundamental attribution error doesn't just make you misunderstand others. It impoverishes relationships, drains connection, and traps you in a small world where only people like you are accepted. But people are not that simple, and neither are you. Behavior does not always reveal character. Sometimes it is just a hidden cry for help, a reaction to an unhealed wound, a sign that someone is trying to stand firm in the midst of things you have never faced. If you truly want to understand others, start by accepting that you do not know it all. And sometimes, staying silent to observe is the kindest act you can offer. I once knew someone who would say the same thing after every major event. I knew it all along. When someone broke up, he would shake his head and smile. I could tell from the first time I met them. When a project failed, he would say, I warned them. At first, I thought he had great intuition, but over time, I realized something was off. Because if he really had known beforehand, why didn't he step in? Why didn't he speak up to prevent it? The truth was, he didn't know. He only thought he knew. And I discovered he wasn't the only one. I had done the same thing. That was when I understood a dangerous force quietly shaping both our memory and our confidence. Hindsight bias. This bias makes you believe you knew something all along after it has already happened. It distorts your memory. It convinces you that you predicted the outcome when in reality, you were never certain. The result? You start to believe you're better at judging situations than you actually are. Worse, you begin to judge others more harshly.
When someone makes a decision and fails, you say, who couldn't have seen that coming? But if you never warned them beforehand, you're speaking from the present, not from an honest memory. And that false, I already knew, kills fairness.
Hindsight bias makes you think everything is obvious once it has happened. It creates a false sense of safety. You look back at someone else's failure and conclude they lacked foresight. You look back at your own mistakes and torment yourself with, I should have known. But the reality is, you couldn't have known. Before something happens, you are standing in the middle of a chaotic web of possibilities. There is no clear storyline. Only after the fact does your brain rearrange events into a neat chain, and in doing so, it deceives you. It makes you feel it was obvious, when in truth, at the time, you were just as uncertain as anyone else. I once made a wrong decision at work. After it failed, I didn't just blame myself. I felt ashamed for not having seen it coming. But when I sat down and honestly looked back, I saw that I had considered many factors and analyzed different angles. At that moment in time, I had acted with all the clarity I had. The only thing I lacked was the ability to see the future. Yet because of hindsight bias, I tricked myself into believing I should have seen this coming. That didn't just crush my confidence. It cut off my chance to learn. Because I wasn't learning from reality, I was judging myself through a distorted past. The most important way to counter hindsight bias is not to try to remember everything perfectly, but to accept that you don't know it all. When you make a decision, write down your reasons, the context, and your thought process. When it's all over, go back and compare your notes to reality. Only then will you see how you truly thought before the event happened. And only then will you have a fair view, not just of others, but of yourself. Hindsight bias makes us unfairly harsh, both outwardly and inwardly. But growth begins when you can admit, I don't know the future. I'm just trying to do my best in the present. And sometimes that is the bravest thing a person can do. I once met someone who lived his entire life in a state of worry, not because his life was particularly risky, but because he couldn't stop imagining the worst-case scenarios. He was afraid of flying because he had once seen news about a plane crash. He avoided investing because he had heard of a friend losing money. He was wary of strangers because he had watched a documentary about scams. All of this created a mental map of the world filled with danger, though in reality, most of those risks would never come close to him. And then I realized this wasn't simply fear, it was the result of a thinking error more common than you might think, availability bias. This is one of the most subtle distortions of perception. It doesn't attack your intelligence, it attacks your memory. More specifically, it targets what you can recall most easily. Our brains do not evaluate probability based on complete data. They rely on what is most vivid, recent, or emotionally striking. If you have just read the news about a robbery, you might judge your city as dangerous. If you watch a clip of a traffic accident, driving suddenly feels far more threatening. The point is, you're not wrong for feeling that way, but you're also not right to treat that feeling as proof of truth.
Availability bias makes us confuse likelihood of happening with likelihood of being remembered. When a piece of information appears repeatedly or is especially shocking or tragic, it sticks in your mind like a stain. And every time you make a decision, instead of asking, what does the objective data say? You unconsciously ask, can I remember an example? And just like that, one isolated story becomes the stand-in for the whole picture.
We end up judging reality through the lens of our most recent memories, not through long-term truth. I remember once, a friend refused to swim in the ocean because he had heard about a shark attack. When I asked if he knew the actual probability of being bitten by a shark, he shook his head. I told him, 1 in a million less likely than being killed by a vending machine. He laughed, but afterward, he still didn't get in the water. Because fear isn't built on probability, it's built on the strongest image in your mind. And that's when I understood, changing the way you think isn't just about providing the right information. It's about clearing out the things that are easy to remember but wrong. Availability bias doesn't only create fear, it can also make you overly optimistic. If you hear someone say they made 10 times their money by investing in a certain cryptocurrency, you might think that's possible, even though you haven't seen the thousands of others who lost everything. Anything easy to recall has a high chance of being mistaken for truth. And that's why the world you perceive, if filtered only through news headlines, social media, and scattered conversations, can be a wildly inaccurate reflection of reality. To escape this mental trap, you have to do something difficult. Step back from the emotion, from the story, from the impression. Ask yourself, is this truly a common risk or just something I've seen recently? And most importantly, learn to live by statistics, not just by memory. Memory is an artist skilled at exaggeration. But if you want to make sound decisions, you must learn to see the world through the eyes of a fact checker, not someone who startles easily. One night, I got a call from a friend. His voice was shaky, tense, urgent. His daughter hadn't come home yet, later than usual. She wasn't answering his calls or replying to his texts. And then, like a chain reaction, his mind started spinning out the worst-case scenarios. A car accident, a kidnapping, something terrible had happened. He turned on the television, and saw a news story, another missing person case. His heart felt like it was being crushed. And just as he was about to call the police, his daughter texted, "I forgot to charge my phone. Just saw your messages. No accident, no tragedy, just a dead phone battery." But in less than an hour, a father's mind had been pulled into a spiral of panic called the availability cascade. Sound familiar? I believe at least once in your life, you've experienced something similar. The availability cascade isn't just a psychological reaction. It's a chain propagation mechanism where a small piece of information, usually extreme or unusual, starts to get amplified. One person hears it, another retells it. A group reacts. The media picks it up, and before long, a small issue turns into a national fear. Not because it's so big, but because it's been repeated so many times. The danger of the availability cascade doesn't lie in the truth, it lies in the frequency. When a piece of information is repeated often enough and appears in enough places, from conversations to social media to the news, your brain starts confusing common with important. A rare but dramatic event can take over your mind, causing you to misjudge how serious or widespread it really is. The more people mention it, the more credible it feels. And that creates a feedback loop, pulling both emotions and actions into its grip. I've seen this happen in the workplace. An employee gets called out for being late. The news spreads. Someone else says they've noticed him being careless before. Another person adds, "I never really trusted him." And just like that, within a few days, a regular employee becomes a company problem, all because of a chain reaction built on unverified impressions. That doesn't just cost someone opportunities, it damages their dignity without anyone actually checking the facts from the start. This effect becomes even more dangerous when the media gets involved. A one-off story gets inflated into a worrying trend. A single accident becomes a symbol of a widespread danger. And soon, an entire society starts reacting. Policies are adjusted, standards are changed, emotions lead the way instead of reason. At the end of that chain of reactions, many important decisions are made not based on verified data, but on emotionally driven anxiety. The truth is, not everything that provokes a strong reaction is worth worrying about. And not everything that's talked about often is truly important. If you don't realize you're being steered by an availability cascade, you can end up living in a constant state of panic while overlooking the real risks. To avoid that, you need to train yourself in a new reflex. When you hear something shocking, don't believe it right away. Pause. Ask, where did this information come from? Has it been verified? Is there actual data showing this is a trend, or is it just an isolated incident? And most importantly, don't let the emotions of the crowd choke the calm within you. I remember one evening, about 30 minutes into a movie, I turned to my friend and said, "This film is really bad." He nodded in agreement. I asked, "Shall we go?" He hesitated for a few seconds, then replied, "We've already bought the tickets. Might as well finish it." So we stayed there for another hour and a half, sitting through a movie we didn't enjoy at all for one very familiar reason. We didn't want to waste the money, but what we actually lost that night wasn't a few dozen dollars. It was our time, our decisiveness, and our freedom to choose. That was when I truly understood the dangerous pull of a common thinking error, the sunk cost fallacy. Have you ever held on to a relationship long after the feelings had faded simply because you've invested too much in it? Stayed in a job that no longer fit you because you've worked too hard for too many years to quit now? Or kept funding a failing project because you've poured in so much money, time, and effort already? If the answer is yes, then you're not making decisions based on the present reality, you're making them based on the past. The sunk cost fallacy is when we let what we've already lost or invested and can't get back influence our current decisions, even when it no longer makes sense. Logic tells you, if something no longer holds value, let it go. But emotions whisper, it's too late to turn back. And that too late is what keeps you heading in the wrong direction, hoping for a miracle to save what cannot be saved. It makes you spend more time, energy, and sometimes even dignity just to protect your ego from admitting you made a mistake. The scariest part isn't that you made the wrong choice. It's that you keep feeding it with misplaced loyalty. I once heard about someone whose marriage lasted 10 years, most of which was filled with endurance, hope, disappointment, and repetition. When asked why they hadn't left, the answer was, "I gave my whole youth to this person. I can't just throw it away like it never existed." But here's the truth. Because they had lost so much, they were afraid to lose more. And the paradox is that fear of losing more is exactly what caused them to keep losing. Every day spent in that relationship was another bad investment, multiplied not out of love, but out of reluctance to let go. The reality is, we cannot change the past. The time, effort, and money already spent are sunk costs, irretrievable. When you let those costs steer your decisions, you trap yourself in a chain of continued losses. The only way to break that cycle is to change the question. Instead of asking, "How much have I already invested?" ask, "From this point forward, what is best for me?" There's nothing wrong with having been wrong, but continuing down the wrong path just because you've been on it, that's what truly destroys you. Sometimes courage isn't about holding on until the very end. It's about knowing when to stop. Accepting that some choices didn't bring the results you hoped for. Facing reality instead of chasing illusions. And giving yourself the chance to start again with a clear mind, even if it means leaving a journey you've traveled far. But remember, no journey is worth it if all it leaves you with is exhaustion. You deserve more than to keep going just because you're afraid of letting go. I have a friend who works in marketing. One day, he handed me 2 cartons of milk. Both were identical in volume, quality, and price. But one was labeled 99% fat-free, while the other read 1% fat. And I, like most people, immediately felt more favorable toward the first one. Same information, same truth. Yet the way it was presented completely changed my perception. That was when I truly understood the power of one of the most subtle cognitive biases, the framing effect. The framing effect happens when the way information is packaged or framed influences your decision, even though the underlying facts remain the same. You're not being swayed by the truth itself, but by how that truth is told. What makes this bias so dangerous is that it targets emotion, not logic. Humans are not purely rational beings, we are emotional machines. And emotions react to words, images, and tone far more than to numbers. I've seen this happen in the meeting room. When an idea was presented as a 10% growth opportunity, people felt excited. But the same idea, when described as a 90% market share loss risk if we don't change, suddenly made the atmosphere tense and skeptical. The problem wasn't in the numbers, it was in the psychological frame they were placed in. And so, many major decisions in companies, in personal life, even in public policy, are made not on substance, but on the surface feeling created by language. The framing effect doesn't just manipulate how you choose, it shapes how you feel about yourself. When someone says you are not yet strong in this skill, it can feel encouraging. But if they say you are weak in this skill, it feels entirely different. Same truth, but packaged in positive language, we are more willing to accept it. Packaged negatively, we feel threatened. From there, confidence, motivation, and fear of failure can all be bent simply by the words someone chooses. This effect is exploited even more subtly in advertising and media. A product labeled as the best-selling item this month sparks a sense of safety and trust, but no one tells you how many were returned for poor quality. A service promoted as 90% customer satisfaction doesn't mention the 10% who left in disappointment. All of it may be true, but it's not the full picture. And our brains don't wait for full data. They only need an appealing frame to make a decision. To escape this trap, you can't avoid frames altogether, but you can learn to spot them. When someone presents information that makes something feel obvious or certain, pause and ask, if I looked at this from another angle, would it still hold true? Train yourself not to be swept away by wording, but to return to the essence. Because in the end, maturity isn't about rejecting emotion. It's about knowing when your emotions are steering you in the wrong direction. And sometimes changing the frame is all it takes to change the decision. One afternoon, I was sitting in the park, looking up at the drifting clouds. A cloud passed overhead, and I burst out laughing because it looked exactly like a whale. The child next to me exclaimed, "Look, it's a smiley face." We both laughed, and then it struck me. Our brains hate randomness. They want to find shapes, patterns, and structures, even when nothing is really there. That's the beauty of imagination, and also the trap that can so easily lead you astray, the clustering illusion. You see the same numbers appear 3 times in a row in the lottery, and you think it's a sign. You hear 3 people tell similar stories, and you believe it's a trend. You look at a string of events in your own life, 3 misfortunes in a row, and you say, I must be unlucky. But the truth could be much simpler. It's just coincidence. Yet the brain refuses to accept randomness. It craves order. It demands a reason. And so it invents structure and then convinces you it's real. The clustering illusion is when we perceive clusters, sequences, or patterns in completely random data. And once you see a pattern, you start assigning meaning to it. You believe there's a hidden rule. You act according to that rule. The danger is the deeper you believe, the more you ignore contradictory evidence because your brain doesn't want to let go of something that feels right. I once met a young investor who believed he had found a golden formula for reading stock charts. He told me, whenever the price line moves like this, the market will reverse. At first, a few correct predictions made him even more confident. He poured in more money, quit his main job to invest full time. Then the market crashed. The pattern didn't repeat. The rule stopped working. But he couldn't bring himself to believe he was wrong. Because once you've seen a face in the clouds, it's hard to accept that it was just water vapor coincidentally taking shape. The clustering illusion taps into our need for control. When you imagine there's a rule behind everything, you feel like you understand life. You feel less anxious. You feel in charge. But real life doesn't work that way. Sometimes 3 bad things happen not because the universe is sending you a message, but simply because 3 bad things happened. Not because they have meaning, but because life is inherently complex, random, and unpredictable. Understanding this doesn't mean abandoning intuition or living as a constant skeptic. It means learning to ask yourself, what I'm seeing, is it the truth, or just what I want to believe is the truth? It means keeping your eyes clear, ready to step back and see the bigger picture, not clinging to details, not getting lost in assumptions. When you can do that, you not only avoid poor decisions, you protect your mental freedom. Freedom from invisible fears, from the illusion of control, from patterns that don't exist. Because sometimes a cloud is just a cloud. It doesn't need to be a whale, a dragon, or someone's face. Just a cloud, and that's enough. I once asked a friend, if you fold a sheet of paper 50 times, how thick would it be? He laughed. Maybe as thick as a book. I said, number. It would be thick enough to reach the sun. Silence, total disbelief. And I realized it wasn't because he lacked intelligence, but because there's one area in which most of us are remarkably weak, our intuition about exponential growth. Human brains are built to understand what is linear, steady, one step at a time. But today's world with technology, information, and even risks operates on an explosive, doubling, compounding rhythm. And if you don't adjust your thinking, you'll always arrive late to your own game. I call this the shock of exponential growth. Linear growth is when you take 30 steps and know exactly where you'll end up. Exponential growth is when, by the time you take your 30th step, that single step takes you farther than all the previous 29 steps combined. From this, even a small change, if doubled for long enough, can lead to unimaginable results. And here's why we often misunderstand it. In the beginning, it still looks slow, like nothing significant is happening. But once the curve goes vertical, you can't catch up. I once spoke to a financial investor. He put $10 into a fund and made only 80 cents after the first year. Someone else laughed. That's it? But he stayed the course. In year 2, the returns doubled. In year 3, they doubled again. By year 10, the amount had surpassed anything anyone could have imagined. Outsiders only saw the final outcome. They didn't see the early phase, faint, slow, and easy to give up on. That's why most people quit, not because what they're pursuing isn't worth it, but because they don't understand that sustainable growth always starts quietly. Exponential growth applies to things you might not expect, like trust, good habits, or even emotional wounds. A kind word to your child every day, just a small thing, but after 5 years, it can shape an entirely different person. A simple act of self-discipline each morning, running for 5 minutes, reading 3 pages, drinking water instead of coffee, seems like a grain of sand at first. But after 1,000 days, it can become the foundation of the career you once dreamed of. Conversely, a harsh criticism repeated weekly, or a moment of unexpressed anger stored every day, these too can compound, then erupt. Do you see? The danger isn't in the big things, it's in the small things repeated for too long. And the most powerful truth is, you get to choose the direction. You can plan a small action today, and if you're persistent and you understand the nature of exponential growth, you'll watch it bend the course of your life. To live wisely in a world that's accelerating, you need 2 things. First, long-term vision to understand that great results demand time. Second, consistency to resist walking away while things still look small, because the exponential curve won't send a warning before it suddenly takes off. It only needs you to trust and keep going, not because it's instantly exciting, but because you understand the law of all great things. I've just shared with you 10 invisible traps, ones I've personally fallen into, paid for with my time, with wrong decisions, and with the silent confusion of not understanding myself. But I didn't tell you these stories to make you fearful. I told them so you could recognize them. Because once you can name the unconscious forces driving you, you have a chance to take back control. No one escapes these thinking errors completely. But the fact that you want to understand yourself better each day already sets you apart from the majority. Most people only react. You're learning to respond with intention. This journey is not easy. It demands that you slow down, observe more closely, have deeper conversations with yourself, and sometimes admit that you were wrong. Yet, it's in those very moments of courage, when you face yourself honestly, that you begin to see your own growth clearly. You'll stop acting purely on impulse. You'll speak less, listen more, and make decisions from a deeper place, not the shallow surface of instant reaction. And that is how you change your life, one day at a time. I know each of us is fighting a silent battle no one else can see. But I truly hope that you will continue down the path of mastering your mind with patience, with courage, and above all, with self-respect. Believe that you deserve to live a life that is awake, intentional, and untangled from forces you cannot name. Thank you for staying, for listening, not only with your ears, but with your mind. I wish you health, enough peace to slow down when needed, and enough strength to move quickly when the time comes. And if one day you find yourself caught in a thinking trap again, smile, because you'll recognize it faster than before, and that in itself will be your greatest victory.